I tackled my radio man into a waterlogged crater 3 seconds before a heavy mortar shell detonated on the exact patch of grass we'd been standing on. There was no whistle, no warning strike in the dirt, no sensory cue that any human brain was designed to process. 1 second, I was standing on a moss-covered knoll in the Shau Valley, adjusting the shoulder straps of my web gear, and the next, a sensation like cold liquid iron was poured directly down my spine. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical, violent force that seized my muscles and threw my whole body weight straight into Private First Class Miller. We crashed hard into the red mud of a decaying bomb crater, and before my helmet even hit the clay, the air above us dissolved into a roaring sphere of white flame and razor-sharp shrapnel. The heat scorched the back of my neck. Red dirt poured down on us like heavy rain, filling my mouth with the iron taste of pulverized sediment and cordite. If we had been standing upright for 3 more seconds, Miller and I would have been turned into grease and bloody rags.
Miller stared up at me through mud-caked eyelashes, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, trying to find oxygen in air that had been momentarily stripped of it. The heavy PRC-25 radio strapped to his back was gouged with jagged slivers of steel that had sheared off the antenna, but the frame had taken the brunt of the flying shrapnel. "Sarge," Miller choked out, his voice cracked with shock. "How did you hear it?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The truth was, I hadn't heard a damn thing. The jungle had been dead silent, right up until the moment the earth tore open. That was May 14th, 1968. We were 9 men from the 101st Airborne, deep in a sector of the Western Highlands, where the maps were mostly blank green spaces, marked with estimated ridgelines. Our mission was a reconnaissance in force, a simple sweep to locate potential supply caches feeding off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But within 10 minutes of step-off from the Huey drop zone, every instinct I'd honed over 8 months of jungle warfare told me we had walked into something massive.
Before I could drag Miller up out of the crater, the jungle surrounding us erupted. The signature clatter of AK-47 fire broke out in a 360-degree arc. The sound wasn't coming from a small ambush element. It was a wall of automatic fire, heavy, sustained, and overlapping. Tracers, bright greenish-red needles of light, wished through the elephant grass, cracking through the air inches above our heads and chewing the elephant ears to ribbons. "Contact front! Contact left!" shouted Corporal Diaz, our point man, his M16 barking back in controlled 3-round bursts from behind a massive teak tree 20 yards to our west. "Sarge, they're everywhere. We walked right into a battalion-sized staging area." Big John, our M60 gunner, dropped to his knees at the edge of the crater, slamming the heavy bipod legs of his weapon into the mud.
He laid on the trigger, the heavy 7.62mm gun chugging out a steady stream of brass, tearing through the jungle canopy and forcing the first line of attackers to duck for cover. "Doc, get up here!" I screamed over the deafening roar of small arms fire. Doc Henderson, our 18-year-old medic from Iowa, crawled into the crater on his elbows and knees, his canvas medical bag clutched tightly against his chest like a newborn child. His eyes were wide with terror, but he was moving. I grabbed Miller by his collar, dragging him toward the rim. "Miller, get the battalion on the horn. Tell them we need gunships and immediate artillery support on these coordinates." Miller fumbled with the radio handset, his hands trembling violently. "Ghost Rider, this is November 6.
We are heavily pinned down. Grid coordinates November Uniform 874-621. We need immediate suppressive fire." The speaker crackled through heavy static. "November 6, this is Ghost Rider. Static interference is heavy. Say again coordinates. We have heavy storm clouds moving into your sector. Close air support is currently grounded at Phu Bai." My heart dropped into my stomach. No air support, no gunships, just 9 men in a ditch, surrounded by a North Vietnamese regular battalion.
I pushed myself
that
up
had us
against the
dead
rim
in their
of the
sights.
crater to bring my M16 to bear on a squad of enemy soldiers advancing through the bamboo thicket 50 meters out.
I aligned my front sight post on the center mass of an NVA officer shouting orders and squeezed the trigger. Click. A dud. A failure to feed. In combat, clearing a jam is second nature. Tap, rack, bang. But as I pulled the charging handle back, the metal bolt locked up solid. It wouldn't budge. It was jammed so tight it was as if the internal components had been fused together by liquid solder. Damn it, I swore, ducking my head back below the dirt line to exert more force on the rifle's charging handle. The very microsecond my head dropped back down into the safety of the mud crater, a heavy 12.7mm machine gun burst tore through the exact space where my face had been positioned a fraction of a second prior. The heavy anti-aircraft rounds slammed into the wooden stock of my jammed rifle, shearing the fiberglass buttstock clean off the receiver and tearing the weapon right out of my hands.
The force of the kinetic strike knocked me backward onto my elbows. I sat there in the red mud, staring at the shattered remnants of my M16 resting in the dirt 6 inches from my boots. If my rifle hadn't jammed, if that mechanical failure hadn't forced me to drop my head to look down at the receiver, that 12.7 round would have taken my head off at the neck. Doc Henderson stared at the shared rifle, then at me. "Sarge, your gun." "Clear it," I barked, refusing to process the sheer mathematical impossibility of what had just happened. "Gomez, fire on that high ridge. Big John, keep that 60 sweeping left to right." We were surrounded, taking fire from elevated positions on 3 sides. The NVA Daners were adjusting their mortars, aiming to drop high explosive rounds directly into our shallow position. The sound of mortar tubes popping in the distance echoed off the surrounding ridges like hollow thuds on a wooden door. Pop, pop, pop. "Incoming," Diaz screamed, pulling his steel pot helmet down tight over his ears.
We pressed ourselves into the bottom of the mud hole, closing our eyes and bracing for the blast that would tear us to pieces. The air whistled violently as the mortars plunged down through the triple canopy jungle. The first shell impacted 20 feet behind us, tearing through the root system of a banyan tree with a bone-jarring crack. The second shell plunged straight into the crater. It landed with a wet, heavy thud precisely 8 inches from Doc Henderson's boots. I closed my eyes, my brain registering that this was the end. The pressure wave would kill us instantly. The shrapnel wouldn't even have time to travel before our lungs ruptured from the displacement of air. I braced for the light, the heat, the pain. Nothing happened. The entire crater fell into a bizarre, suspended stillness that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, while the battle raged around us in a blur of motion. I opened my eyes. The 82mm mortar shell was buried fin first in the soft mud, right between Doc's feet.
The casing had split wide open upon impact with a submerged rock, spilling its internal payload of dull yellow TNT explosive into the mud like pulverized chalk. But the fuse, the small brass impact primer at the tip of the nose cone, had sheared off sideways without igniting. Doc Henderson was frozen, staring down at the unexploded weapon lying between his knees. The odds of a high-explosive mortar shell falling from 200 feet, impacting a rock, splitting its shell, and failing to detonate the primary fuse were practically non-existent. It was a statistical anomaly so absolute it defied every principle of weapons manufacturing and ballistics. "Don't move," I whispered, my own voice sounding distant to my ears, as if I were listening to myself speak from the end of a long tunnel. "Nobody touch it." "Sarge," Miller whispered, his eyes wide with an emotion that wasn't just fear anymore. It was something bordering on terrifying awe. "What is happening out here?"
"Keep firing," I shouted, shaking off the paralysis that was trying to creep over my limbs. I reached down, grabbed a fallen Colt .45 pistol from my webbing, and racked the slide back. "We hold this position until we find a way out."
The afternoon bled into twilight, and the rain began to fall in heavy, suffocating sheets, turning the valley floor into a swamp of red mud and waist-deep runoff. The storm clouds that had grounded our air support now sealed the canopy in complete, pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the sporadic flash of muzzle bursts and the eerie green illumination flares hanging under silk parachutes far above the storm line. We were down to our last magazines. Big John's M60 was out of ammunition. He had pulled his bayonet and sat crouched at the lip of the hole, waiting for the inevitable ground assault. We could hear the NVA soldiers shouting to one another in the dark, moving through the high grass, closing the perimeter, sweeping the area to finish off survivors. They were 50 feet away, then 30. There was no way out.
The map showed a sheer rock wall directly behind us to the north, making retreat impossible. To our left and right were enemy machine gun bunkers that had us cross-filed in an overlapping kill zone. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the dirt wall of the crater, trying to formulate a final tactical maneuver. I needed a direction, a line of attack, anything that would give my men a fighting chance to pull off an egress before we were overrun. And then it happened again. It wasn't an auditory voice. It was a sharp, overwhelming sensory command that flooded my mind with absolute, unyielding clarity. It felt like a warm hand pressing hard against my left shoulder, spinning me toward a wall of dense, thorn-covered jungle vegetation that rested at the back edge of our crater. To any trained infantry leader, that thorn wall was a dead end. It was an impenetrable mass of razor-sharp, wait-a-minute vines and thick brush that backed directly against the vertical rock face of the ridge. To go into that brush meant getting tangled, trapped, and slaughtered in the dark. Yet the impulse was so powerful that my muscles moved before my logical brain could protest. "Pack it up," I snapped in an urgent whisper, grabbing Miller's shoulder strap. "We're moving." Diaz crawled over, his eyes frantic. "Sarge, move where? The NVA are 40 yards to the front, and the bunker teams are holding both flanks." "Through the brush," I said, pointing toward the black wall of thorn vines behind us. "Sarge, that's a dead end," Diaz choked back a scream. "That's a rock wall. If we go in there, we're cornered." "Move," I ordered, my voice carrying an absolute authority that stopped any further argument in its tracks. "Doc, get behind Miller. Big John, take the rear. Touch the pack of the man in front of you. Do not let go, no matter what you hear." I didn't wait to see if they were following. I turned and thrust myself shoulder first into the dense razor-sharp wall of thorn vines. I expected the sharp thorns to tear through my jungle fatigues, to rip into my skin, and trap me like wire. But as I shoved my weight forward, my body didn't hit a wall of wood and thorns. My feet slipped out from under me, and I tumbled downward into a hidden, subterranean crevice in the earth, a narrow, dried-up drainage stream bed that sat completely beneath the root systems of the jungle floor, hidden entirely from aerial view and from the ground level by the heavy carpet of canopy foliage. It was a natural tunnel, 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, cutting straight through the base of the rock wall and sloping steadily downward away from the ridge. It was a geological feature that didn't exist on any military topographical map. One by one, the men slid down into the darkness behind me, tumbling into the soft sand of the dried creek bed. "Cover your Above
mouths,"
us,
I
not
whispered into the
3
dark.
feet over our heads,
Not a sound.
through the thick roof of roots and thorn vines, we heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots. An NVA search squad was walking directly over the top of our hidden tunnel. We could hear the wooden stocks of their weapons clicking against their gear, the heavy breathing of the soldiers, and the sharp, guttural commands of their squad leader as they searched the mud crater we had abandoned mere seconds before. If we had stayed in that crater for 30 more seconds, we would have been annihilated. We sat frozen in the pitch darkness of the earth, holding our breath, listening as the enemy search party swept past our position, searching for men who had seemingly vanished into thin air. For 2 hours, we crawled on our hands and knees through that dark, hidden subterranean channel,
guided only by the touch of the rock walls and the persistent, unexplainable gut pull that led us forward through the winding earth. We moved silently, a line of 9 ghosts slithering beneath the feet of an entire enemy battalion.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, the tunnel began to slope upward. I pushed aside a thick veil of hanging moss and stepped out into a clearing. The cool morning mist was clinging to the floor of a wide, flat LZ 2 miles south of our original contact point, far beyond the perimeter of the enemy force holding the valley ridge. The sky above was beginning to break into tiny slivers of pale gray light. The rain had stopped. I climbed out of the wash, turning to help Miller drag his heavy radio gear up onto the firm grass of the clearing. One by one, all 9 men crawled out of the earth. Not one of us was missing. Not one of us had suffered a mortal wound. Aside from deep scratches, mud-stained uniforms, and frayed nerves, the entire squad was standing on 2 feet. Miller sank down onto a flat boulder, unstrapping the ruined PRC-25 radio from his back. He reached into his chest pocket, his fingers trembling, and pulled out a small metallic object that had been resting over his heart throughout the entire 8-hour engagement.
It was his brass pocket watch, a gift from his father before he deployed overseas. He held it up in the dim dawn light. The heavy brass casing was crushed flat, completely indented by a jagged piece of mortar shrapnel that had penetrated his outer fatigue jacket during the initial blast. The sharp piece of steel was still wedged deep into the center of the mechanical gears, stopped less than a millimeter short of the rear casing that rested against his ribs. The watch hands were frozen at precisely 3:15 p.m., the exact minute the first mortar round had detonated above our heads. Miller looked up at me, his eyes wide with a quiet, terrified understanding. "Sarge, it stopped it." I looked around at the rest of the men. Doc Henderson was sitting on his pack, staring down at his undamaged boots. Diaz was inspecting his empty M16 magazines, shaking his head in total disbelief. Big John was quietly muttering a prayer under his breath, holding a brass crucifix he had pulled from beneath his dog tags.
An hour later, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of incoming rotor blades echoed through the mountain pass. A pair of UH-1 Huey slicks broke through the low-hanging cloud deck, their skids clipping the tops of the bamboo as they banked hard toward our position in the open clearing. As the helicopters touched down, kicking up a cyclone of grass and red dust, the flight medic jumped out from the side door, clutching a medical kit, expecting to see a field strewn with casualties based on our last frantic radio transmission. He ran up to me, looking over my shoulder at the 8 men sitting calmly in a circle on the grass. "Where are the rest of your guys?" the medic yelled over the deafening roar of the turbine engines. "Where's the body count? We were told November 6 took a direct hit from a battalion-sized element." "This is all of us," I said, my voice hoarse and hollow. The medic blinked, looking around the empty clearing, then down at my shredded uniform, my broken rifle frame dangling from my shoulder strap, and the mangled radio sitting on the dirt.
"You guys walked out of that valley?" he asked, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "Tactically speaking, that's impossible. Nobody walks out of that pocket when the weather shuts down." "Yeah," I said, looking back at the dark, mist-shrouded ridgelines of the Shau Valley rising up into the morning sky like jagged teeth. "It is." I turned and ushered my men onto the deck of the helicopter. As the skids lifted off the earth and the green jungle fell away beneath us, I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking. In war, ballistics are simple. Metal tears flesh. High explosives create shockwaves. Numbers and fire superiorities dictate who lives and who dies on a nameless patch of red dirt. The military academies teach tactical logic, fire and maneuver doctrines, and probability matrices. But on that damp afternoon in May of 1968, in a dark valley near the Laotian border, the math simply stopped working. A jammed rifle saved a skull. An unexploded fuse saved a squad.
A hidden path in the earth saved 9 lives. Call it luck if you want to. Call it a bizarre chain of statistical anomalies that hit all at once in the dark. But every man who sat on the floor of that Huey as it climbed out of the smoke knew the truth. We hadn't survived because of our training, and we hadn't survived because of our firepower. We had walked through the shadow of death, and something far beyond tactical logic, had carried us home.